Open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. Daniel 1, verse 8. And there's an outline in your bulletin if you'd like to follow along. One of my Christian heroes, one of the heroes of the Christian faith for me was the British politician William Wilberforce. How many have heard of William Wilberforce? A lot of you, yeah. William Wilberforce was an evangelical Christian. His spiritual advisor was the former slave trader John Newton. How many have heard of John Newton? All of you should have heard of John Newton. Why? Because John Newton wrote the famous hymn, Amazing Grace. Right? He wrote the famous hymn. John Newton, the Lord got a hold of his heart, and he converted to Christianity and repented from his life as a slave trader. And he was a spiritual advisor to William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a politician during the time that slavery was an important part of the British economy throughout the whole British Empire. And Wilberforce spent much of his career as a politician trying to abolish slavery. That was his passion. He, as a believer, he found slavery reprehensible. And he did everything he could to try to eliminate it. A movie several years ago came out called Amazing Grace. How many have seen that movie, Amazing Grace? A lot of you have. It's one of my favorite movies. It's really good. And I wanted to show a clip from the movie and just to show you a little bit about his life. So this is from the movie Amazing Grace.
Order! Order! On the Home and Foreign Slave Trade Act, the unamended bill calling for the abolition of the slave trade throughout the entire British Empire.
Noes to the left, 16. Ayes to the right, 283.
Of abolition of the slave trade to be passed.
Noblesse oblige.
What the bloody hell does that mean?
It means nobility obliges me to recognize the virtue of an exceptional commoner.
When people speak of great men, they think of men like Napoleon, men of violence. Rarely do they think of peaceful men. But contrast the reception they'll receive when they return home from their battles. Napoleon will arrive in pomp and in power, a man who's achieved the very summit of earthly ambition. And yet his dreams will be haunted by the oppressions of war. William Wilberforce, however, will return to his family, lay his head on his pillow, and remember, the slave trade is no more.
William Wilberforce, in my mind, the epitome of faithfulness. You know, for 18 years, he instituted acts, tried to put in place laws that would abolish the slave trade in the British Empire. For 18 years, he was defeated. But he was faithful. He was faithful to do what God called him to do, even when he was mocked, even when he was ridiculed by his political opponents. And in 1807, I believe, by the grace of God, the slave trade throughout the British Empire was abolished. William Wilberforce today is buried in Westminster Abbey in London. And he's considered one of the great politicians of the British Empire. So why do I highlight William Wilberforce today as we start our study? Here's why. Because as we study the book of Daniel, we're going to see that God calls his people to be faithful. And as God calls his people to be faithful, he often elevates them to high positions where they can demonstrate that faithfulness, such as William Wilberforce. And we're going to see in Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also. So if you found Daniel chapter 1, let's go ahead and stand together. Daniel chapter 1, verses 8. We're going to read 8 through 16 and then 20 through 21. And as we read this story, this account in the book of Daniel, I want us to notice how Daniel and his three cohorts were faithful to God. It says, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigns your food and drink. What if he sees your face is looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. May God bless the reading of his word. You may be seated. So Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah, they were faithful to what God called them to do. And God calls us to be faithful. Today we're going to talk about three things that we should know about being faithful in an unbelieving world. We live in an unbelieving world, don't we? Yes, there are believers in this world, but there's also lots of people around us who don't believe. Maybe you're here today and you're not sure about what you believe. But we're going to talk about three things that we need to know. The first thing is this: We need to be determined to be faithful to God's commands. Whether it jeopardizes our safety, whether it jeopardizes our well-doing, we need to be faithful to what God calls us to do. Sorry for the ringing sound. I think we're trying to figure out what that is. Don't know. Okay. We'll just have to ignore it. Okay. We need to be faithful to what God calls us to do. In verse 8, it says, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. Now, apparently at this point, Daniel was the leader of the Jewish group of 4. He was in a leadership position with them. He was also the first to be determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. Now, what does that mean, to defile himself? To understand that, we have to go back to the Jewish law, right? To the dietary regulations. The Jews were not allowed to eat what the Bible calls unclean food. Yes, pork was a part of that. There was a whole list of things they were not allowed to eat. There was also important regulations about how food was prepared, the preparation of food. And historians tell us that in Babylon during that time, pork and also horse was a very common meat in the diet of the Babylonians. So it's very likely that the king's food, the meat that came from his table, included pork, included possibly horse. So this would have defiled Daniel and his cohorts. But also there was the point about how the food is prepared. If you remember, Babylon was a place where idols were worshipped. There were temples to the gods of Babylon. And a lot of scholars say that it's very likely that the food that came from the table of the king was first used in the sacrificial worship service to these gods, because that was very important in that culture. So the meat that came to the king's table was often first a sacrifice in the pagan temples. So for Daniel and the Jewish 3, it would have been defiling for them to partake of the king's food. Also the wine, because the wine was used in the Babylonian worship services also as a sacrifice. So Daniel and the 3 Jewish cohorts, they were determined to not defile themselves. They were determined to be faithful to the commands that God had given them. He goes on to say in verse 8, he says, so he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. I mean, this was a big deal, right? This was a big deal. So for Daniel and the Jewish 3, if they were going to take such a drastic step, they had to get permission. They couldn't just decide all of a sudden that they were going to do it. They had to get permission from their supervisor. This was a big deal. Verse 9 says that God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. That's huge. Don't miss that. Because if the chief eunuch, if he heard their request and right away he said no way, then the conversation was over. Forget about it. I mean, this could cost Daniel his life. But God says that Daniel was granted kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Well, what does that mean? Well, it possibly means Ashpenaz. You remember we talked about him last week? That was the name of the chief eunuch. It possibly means that he had compassion towards them, meaning that he understood that as Jewish people, they had strict, pious regulations that they had to live by. He understood that. And so he had compassion for them. The last thing that he would want for his prize students is to be walking around with a guilty conscience, right? I mean, that wouldn't benefit anybody. So Ashpenaz, he has kindness, he has compassion towards Daniel and his cohorts. Verse 10 says, this is Ashpenaz's reply to the request. He says, I fear my lord the king, who assigns your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Ashpenaz says, okay, I hear it. I hear your request. I see what you want, but you need to remember that the king is the one who set in place this diet. He is the one who ordered the meat that you were supposed to be eating. He is the one that made the regulations about the wine. So this is a big deal. So the question is, did Ashpenaz, did he give consent or not? That's the question. We'll look at verse 11. It says, so Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. So apparently at this point, Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, they had separate quarters of where they lived. And Ashpenaz put a guard over them. One translator says that he was a steward. He wasn't a military guard, but he was a steward to watch over them. Now the question is, again, is Daniel doing an end around here, right? Did Ashpenaz, did he give his permission, or is Daniel going over him or going under him to his subordinate and doing an end around here? Well, I think that's a possibility. Daniel didn't get what he wanted when he talked to Ashpenaz, at least not directly. But there's also another possibility. And the other possibility is that Ashpenaz did get his permission, at least indirectly. But Ashpenaz didn't want to be held responsible for the decision. It's kind of like when I was in high school. After those summer football practices, it was about 95 degrees in Sacramento. Just blazing hot. And we were worn out and we were tired. And myself and the other players, we would come to our coach. We would say, hey, coach, do you mind if we jump in the pool at the school? Do you mind if we just hop in? Now, my football coach, he was shrewd. He was a pretty wise guy. See, he wanted to please his players, but he also didn't want to get in trouble. So he would say usually something like, you know, guys, you can go ahead and do it, but I didn't know about it. Now, maybe you call that dishonesty. Maybe that's not being straightforward. But that's possibly Ashpenaz. That's possibly where he was coming from, that he indirectly gave permission to Daniel. But he didn't want to know about it. So Daniel goes to the guards. He goes to the guard and he puts in place this test. This big test. Now I got to say about the test, right? What was the test? The test was that they would live on a diet of vegetable and water. Vegetables and water. That was it. No meat. far as we can tell, no dairy. And there's some different opinions about that diet. One scholar by the name of Dr. Gleason Archer, who's now deceased, he was the Old Testament professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Dr. Archer said that this was nothing short of a miracle. It had to be a miracle. There was no way that Daniel and his 3 cohorts, that by living on a diet of vegetables and water, there's no way that they could look better and healthier than the other students. He called it a reversal of the laws of nutrition. And I don't know if you know a lot about nutrition. I don't. But I was reading up about it this week. And as far as I can tell, most nutritionists would agree with Dr. Archer that there's no way that on a pure diet of pure vegetables and water that they could be healthier. Why? Because it has to do with calorie intake. Right? You sure got to eat a lot of vegetables to have enough calories to live on a daily basis, to have the energy that you need to do the tasks. I mean, you got to eat a lot of carrots, right? You got to eat a lot of cucumbers to compare to a Big Mac. But also there's the issue of vitamin D and vitamin B12. Where are you going to get that from? Now, there is another possibility. If we have more of a generous interpretation of vegetables, if we include fruit, if we include grains and nuts and beans, there is a possibility that you can live on a diet like that and still be healthy and still have energy. Today, they call it the Daniel Plan. How many have heard of the Daniel Plan? Right? It's a diet that Rick Warren down at Saddleback and Dr. Oz have made famous. And it's exactly what I just explained. So was it a miracle? Was it a miracle? Did God intervene and go against the laws of nature to make Daniel and the 3 other Jewish boys healthy with just vegetables and water? Or was it a generous definition of vegetables, like the Daniel Plan? We don't know. We don't know for sure. But I will say that it was a miracle. Because either way, it was a miracle that they were allowed to reject the food from the king. Right? That they were allowed to even take on this test. But Daniel tells us that they took on the test for 10 days. And at the end of that time, Daniel and his 3 Jewish friends were found in better health and just in general healthier than all the other students who were part of the academy. God had been glorified. Daniel and his 3 friends were faithful to the commands that God had given them, right? They didn't disobey the law. And yet, in the end, they were more healthier than the other students in the academy. Now, through the history of the church, we have seen amazing stories of God's people being faithful in the midst of a non-believing community. Right? I can think of stories of Eric Liddell, the Olympic athlete in 1924, who decided that he would not compete on Sunday because that was his Sabbath, and went on to win the gold medal in the 400, which he wasn't even favored in. I was also thinking about one of my heroes when I was a kid, a guy by the name of A.C. Green. How many of you have heard of A.C. Green before? Yeah, we got some Lakers fans out there? Yeah, right on. I was a Lakers fan as a kid growing up in California. I loved the Lakers. I I worshiped the Lakers. My dad was a Lakers fan. A.C. Green was on some of the championship teams in the late 90s, early 90s. A.C. Green, he wasn't the greatest scorer on the team. He wasn't the most popular guy on the team. But A.C. was the most dependable player on the team. See, A.C. Green set the record for playing in the most consecutive games. A.C. Green played in 1,192 consecutive basketball games. Now, some of you that don't know anything about basketball, you're like, well, what's the big deal? Basketball is a physical sport, and people get hurt all the time. 1,192 consecutive games. And during that streak, AC started to come into prominence. People were saying, who is this guy, this Iron Man of basketball? And it became known that A.C. Green was a follower of Jesus Christ. But not only that, A.C. Green was single. And A.C. Green had the conviction that he would not be in a sexual relationship until he was married. Now, this is back in the 90s. And this was a time when other athletes were bragging about their exploits. And A.C. Green, I remember, he was mocked. He was ridiculed by the media for that conviction that he held to. But you know what? A.C. Green was faithful. He was faithful to do what God called him to do. And because of A.C. Green being a part of the Lakers, they went on to win 3 championships. And God brought a young woman by the name of Veronica into his life. And in 2002, A.C. and Veronica were married. And they're living for the Lord today. A.C. Green's retired now, and he started the A.C. Green Foundation, which serves underprivileged youth throughout our country. It mentors youth. He's also the director of the MBA in India. I didn't know India had an MBA. But he's a director of that. The question that I want us to think about this morning is, where are we being tempted? Where is the enemy tempting us to defile ourselves? Where are we being tempted to turn our back on God and giving up a life of faithfulness? Maybe it's your time. Maybe you're not engaging in fellowship the way God wants you to, because you're more focused on worldly values. Maybe you're more focused on fixing up your house or engaging in your hobbies. Or maybe it's in the area of your personal integrity. Maybe you're being tempted to compromise at work so that you can get ahead of your coworkers. Maybe it's in the area of sexuality. Maybe it's entertainment. Where are you being tempted to compromise your convictions? Whatever it is, friends, God has called us to be faithful, like Daniel, like AC, so that we can bring glory to Him. The second thing that we need to know about being faithful in an unbelieving world is that God will give us gifts to empower us to be faithful. God doesn't leave us alone. The first gift that He gives us is Himself. He invites us into a relationship with Him. But not only that, He gives us special gifts. He gives us special abilities to enable us to be faithful. God gave special gifts to Daniel. Verse 17 says, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. Now, one of the things that we're going to see as we study the book of Daniel is that God is not a distant God. God is not the unmoved mover that just sets things in motions and then hangs out on the sideline. God is directly involved in each of our lives. And we saw that last week when God allowed Israel, because of their disobedience, to be taken into exile. And now we see that God gives these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. As I was looking this past week, what is literature? What is it defined as? And literature is the entire body of writings of a specific language, period, or people. Now remember, Daniel and his 3 cohorts, they were Jews. They were not Chaldeans. So they had a lot of learning that they needed to do. And God gave these guys special gifts, the ability to know and understand literature and wisdom. During this time, it would have been the Akkadian and Sumerian writings that they had to become familiar with, of the history of the Chaldeans and Babylon. But not only that, it says that God gave them wisdom. Do you remember back several hundred years earlier, their great-grandfather Solomon, God said to Solomon, you can have whatever you want. You remember what Solomon asked for? He asked for wisdom. Wisdom. Apparently, Daniel and his 3 Jewish cohorts, they had the same knowledge of wisdom. They knew that wisdom was important, and God gave it to them. Daniel was also enabled by God to master the ability to interpret dreams and visions. Remember somebody else back in the history of Israel that had that same gift? Who? Joseph. That's right. When the Israelites were in their first exile in Egypt, God gave that gift to Joseph, and that came in handy. As a matter of fact, because of that gift, Joseph was elevated to second command in Egypt. And we're going to see later on in Daniel that this is also a very important gift that God's given to Daniel to promote God's purposes. God enables his people to be faithful, but God has also given believers gifts to help them be faithful in an unbelieving world. If you remember in the New Testament, in Acts 2, during Pentecost, God enabled the disciples to be able to preach the gospel in the native language of the people that had gathered in Israel, in Jerusalem. Remember that story? People from all over the world, Jewish believers, had gathered together to celebrate Pentecost, and God enabled the church to be able to preach the gospel in their own native language. God also empowered the disciples, Peter and John and Paul, to be able to heal the sick and to raise the dead. And today, God is empowering believers all around the world to be able to learn the languages of native people, many of them who have never heard of Christ, so that the Bible can be translated into their native tongue, into their heart language. And God also gives the gifts to people to teach his word to those people. How has God gifted you? Every single one of us, whether you believe it or not, has been given gifts. How has God empowered you and given you a gift to enable you to be faithful? Maybe God has given you the ability to build friendships with people because of your sense of humor. I know there's some pretty good sense of humors in this group. Maybe God's given you that gift. Or maybe God has given you financial security in your life. And He hasn't given you that gift so that you can be selfish. He's given you that gift so that you can use it to care for others. You can use the money He's entrusted to you to build up His kingdom. How has God gifted you? Because He has given gifts to every single one of us. The question is, will we use those gifts He's given us? Lastly, the last thing we need to know about being faithful in an unbelieving world is our faithfulness will be recognized and rewarded. When we are faithful to God, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes we are elevated to exalted positions so that we can demonstrate that faithfulness. You say, what do you mean? Well, look at Daniel. Daniel 1, verse 20. It says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Oops, I think I skipped the slide. Back to verse 18. Verse 18 says, at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. So the time came after 3 years. The Royal Academy of Babylon came to graduation time. And Azariah presents all the students who are in the academy to the king. And the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he personally interviews every one of the students. Why? Because he wants to figure out who the cream of the crop are. Right? Who are the gold nuggets in the group? And it says that when he interviewed them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These 4 Jewish young men who were faithful to God. They were faithful to the commands that God had given them. No one was found equal to them. They were far superior to all the other students in the academy. So, because of that, Nebuchadnezzar put them into service. They began to attend the king. God's up to something, isn't He? Now, verse 20 says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Verse 20 helps us understand what their role was. Their role in the court was to be counselors to the king. They were consultants to the king. They had the responsibility of helping the king make wise decisions about the kingdom. Now, what does it take to be a wise counselor or a consultant? I was listening to a podcast just this last week called Against the Rules by Michael Lewis. How many have heard of Michael Lewis? Anybody? Michael Lewis wrote the book Moneyball. Probably you've seen the movie Moneyball. Yeah. And Michael Lewis, he was interviewing a guy by the name of Kenneth Feinberg. Kenneth Feinberg is an attorney. And Kenneth Feinberg is called the Neutral. That's his nickname, the Neutral. Kenneth Feinberg was the guy that was called in after 9/11 when they established the 9/11 Victims Fund. And somebody had to have the hard decision to come in and decide who got what, right? One family got this much. Another family got a different amount. I mean, that's a hard decision. And Kenneth Feinberg, I don't know if you've ever heard his name, but he routinely is called into those difficult situations that require a mediator. And so Michael Lewis asked Kenneth, he said, Kenneth, what does it take to be the type of person who can come into these situations and mediate? And Kenneth described 3 qualities. The first quality he described is empathy. If you are going to be a mediator, a counselor in these type of situations, you need to have empathy. You need to be able to listen to the parties, to listen to where they're coming from. He said the second thing that you need is you need a strong sense of self. And what he meant by that was, he said, is that you need to be somebody who doesn't care what people think about you. You need to be somebody who doesn't care what people's perception is going to be of you after you made the decision. But lastly, he said, in spite of that, or because of that, you need to be somebody who intimidates because of your character. Say, what? What do you mean by that? You need to be somebody who intimidates with force of character and righteousness. Kenneth Feinberg in the interview talked about King Solomon. He quoted 1 Kings 3:28. And verse 28 says, all Israel heard about the judgment the king had given, and they stood in awe of the king because they saw that God's wisdom was in him to carry out justice. People were in awe of Solomon. They had reverence towards Solomon. Why? Because they saw that God's wisdom was in him. Is God wisdom in you? Do people come away from conversations with you saying, wow, what is it about that person? There's something different about them. Well, Daniel and his 3 Jewish friends, they had those qualities. They had the wisdom that God had given them. And because of that, they were able to help the king make very important decisions. And so God elevated Daniel and his friends in the eyes of the king because they were faithful. Friends, in the last 2,000 years, God has routinely elevated believers to exalted positions to demonstrate his faithfulness. You say, what do you mean? Well, I've already talked about A.C. Green. How many have heard of Dr. Francis Collins? Dr. Francis Collins is one of the most famous researchers in our country. He's the head of the Human Genome Project. He's a believer in Jesus Christ. And he's not afraid to claim it. How about researchers like Louis Pasteur, who was a part of creating the cure for polio? Humanitarians like Jean-Henri Dunant, who was a part of founding the Red Cross. And more recently, Christine Caine, who is a part of founding the A21 campaign to stop human trafficking. God has elevated these people. He's put them in these positions Not because it's an accident. No, God has purposely, in His sovereignty, put these people in these positions to be faithful, to demonstrate His glory. Last year, God allowed me to be able to coach the Babe Ruth national team here in North Eugene. I didn't want the job, honestly, but there was nobody else. And so I did it. And it wasn't an easy year, right? You remember me telling the stories about that? We finished 4-17. But you know what? Through that experience, I was able to demonstrate character. I was able to demonstrate integrity to a group of players and a group of parents who had been burned in the past by coaches. I was also able to be a witness to my fellow coaches and to share the gospel with them and to give God glory. Friends, if you are faithful, God will often, not always, but He will often put you in those places of authority, those exalted positions where you can demonstrate your faithfulness to God and to give Him glory. So what's our takeaway today? What do I want us to walk away with this morning? 3 things that I believe that I want us to know is that, number 1, we need to be determined to be faithful to God's commands no matter the outcome. No matter the outcome. Number 2, we need to use the gifts He's given you to demonstrate faithfulness. God has given each of you gifts. If you don't know what they are, then come talk to me, and we'll figure it out. But God has given each of you gifts, and He wants you to use those gifts to demonstrate faithfulness. Lastly, be faithful in the position He has placed you in to bring glory to His name. Friends, it's not an accident that you are in the positions that God has put you in the places where you work, students in the schools that you go to, the teams that you're on. It's not an accident. God has placed you there for a reason, and He wants you to use that position for His glory. I'm going to invite the worship team to come forward. We're going to close our time in worship. On the back of your outline are some questions that I would like you to take a look at, maybe later today or tomorrow, just to think more about this story in Daniel. But let's go ahead and stand together and let's worship the Lord.